This is the video where you learn everything you need to know about your DJI OM4 gimbal. So I'm going to talk about the different modes, when to use them, and how to get the most from them. And I'm going to talk about the DJI Mimo app, when to use it and when not to use it. But first, let's talk about the two core features of the DJI OM4 and 3 gimbals, which you should spend a little bit of time on before you start using your gimbal. Now, did you know there's two ways to switch gimbal modes on these Osmo Mobile gimbals? What I'm talking about here specifically is changing the way the gimbal motors work, because there are various modes which tell the gimbal exactly how you want the gimbal to keep your smartphone stable. For example, you can tell the gimbal to follow all your movements by switching to follow mode, or you can tell it to only follow your pan movements, which is like a sideways movement, but not to follow your tilt movements by switching to the tilt locked mode. One way to switch modes is to open the Mimo app on your smartphone. So you need to be set up and connected via Bluetooth. Tap the gimbal settings button in the left corner of the screen and these three dots. And now select the middle of these three icons on the left of the screen. So you can see at the moment I'm in follow mode. So if I tap where it says follow in the box, there's 4 modes to choose from. There's also an option to toggle on and off sport mode. So that's one way to change modes, but it's not the most convenient. So it would be nice if we could change modes using the gimbal buttons instead. And actually, you can just by tapping the M button. But if you tap your M button and find all it does is switch from photo to video mode, then you need to change something in the settings. So in the same screen where we just changed modes, scroll down a bit to where it says press M button. In the corresponding box, if it says photo video, tap it and select quick menu instead. And now tap out of the settings screen. So you'll see when you tap the M button now, it opens up a menu with all the modes listed. Not just the gimbal motor modes, but all the other Mimo app modes as well. So you just use the joystick to navigate up and down the main list. So the gimbal motor modes are listed on the right. Use the joystick to navigate to this list and then select the mode you want. So I'll select tilt locked and then press the M button again, which takes me back to the main screen. And the gimbal is now in tilt locked mode. Before you start using your gimbal, you might want to check that it's calibrated properly. So just check to make sure the horizon looks level. Now, if you're standing somewhere where the horizon isn't actually level, because maybe you're on a slight incline, and it can look as if your gimbal isn't set correctly, when in fact it is. By default, when it's correctly calibrated, the DJI OM4 or 3 will be level with a perfectly level horizon. So if your smartphone seems to be sitting at a strange angle, first thing you can do is to try the auto calibration. Back in the same screen where we set modes, scroll down a bit more until you get to where it says Gimbal Auto Calibration. So place the gimbal on a flat surface, tap calibrate, let it run through the auto calibration routine. It just takes a few seconds. But if you're still not happy with the angle of the phone, you can also adjust the horizon level by hand. So this is one of the great features of the Mimo app. Why all smartphone gimbal apps don't have this feature, I don't know, because I find this to be so useful. To use this feature, tap the arrow beside where it says horizontal gimbal adjustment. First, it just asks you to make sure your smartphone is sitting correctly in the clamp, which is a good idea. So make sure that it's all nice and level in the clamp. My phone is mounted well, so I'm going to click OK. And now we get a control to allow us to manually adjust the horizontal angle of the smartphone. You can see I already have my gimbal set to plus 1.3. That's because I already adjusted this before and it remembers for the next time you use the gimbal, which is really, very useful. So use the two buttons, plus and minus, to get your smartphone perfectly level. Now there is another reason why you might want to use this feature, because as I said, you might be standing on ground which is not exactly level. But what if you want your smartphone to be at the same angle as the ground? So you can use this manual adjustment to align your phone with the unlevel ground. And this can also be a creative choice if you think the shot looks better this way. So just tap done when you're happy with the setting. Now here's an OM4 feature I really love. This gimbal has a way of moving that is a bit different to other gimbals. If you pan left or right, you might notice that when you stop moving, the gimbal keeps moving and then slows to a stop. This allows you to kind of ease out of the shot, and that looks much nicer than if you suddenly stopped. However, this does take a little bit of practice to get right sometimes. What we need to do is to stop a little bit before we want the shot to end. For example, if I want to pan and then end on this, I need to stop and then allow the gimbal to ease into that final frame. And now I let it record a little bit. Remember, don't stop your shots too soon. Unless you know you definitely will be cutting to the next shot before, just hold a few seconds, count to 3 and then stop recording. Sometimes you might want the gimbal to stop more abruptly, and you can get it to do this as well. So I'll talk about that later though. But first, I want to talk about the different gimbal modes. If you count sport mode, there's 6 modes which control how the gimbal motors move your smartphone. The first 2 modes are probably the most useful. Those modes are follow mode and tilt locked mode. I almost always have my OM4 in one of those 2 modes. In follow mode, the gimbal motors are guided by your movement, but only on the pan and tilt axis. That means if I pan left or right, the gimbal follows. If I tilt backwards or forwards, the gimbal follows. But if I roll my wrist like this, the gimbal does not follow. Instead, the gimbal keeps the smartphone level with the horizon. This is a very useful mode if you want to keep some flexibility in your movement, but you still want to keep the horizon level. If you think about it, follow mode is the most similar to the way people observe the world. When we look around, we generally use the same kind of movements with our head. We turn left and right, we look up and down, but we rarely tilt our heads to the side. And that's why in movies, you rarely see the camera tilt on the horizontal plane. So when might a shot like that be used? Well, when we want to show someone being drunk maybe, or on a ship in rough sea, and the ship is rolling side to side. The point is, when the camera tilts on the horizontal plane, it makes the viewer feel a bit uneasy. So that's why follow mode is a good mode for a good majority of the shots. It creates the most natural movement, similar to how we observe the world. Tilt locked mode is actually quite similar, so let's look at that next. In tilt locked mode, the gimbal only follows your pan movements. And if you tilt the gimbal handle backwards or forwards, it keeps the camera at the same tilt angle. That said, one limit of these small gimbals is that it will only lock tilt up to a point. So if I keep moving, you will see it eventually does tilt. But as long as our tilt movement is minimal, it's not going to be a problem. Tilt lock mode is the best mode for simple moving forward or backward shots. For walking shots where you are either tracking a subject or tracking yourself, this is probably the best mode. This mode will keep your smartphone steady and pointing at your subject. One other use for tilt locked mode is when you're shooting some kind of crane shot. So this is a shot which rises up smoothly or drops down smoothly. Crane shots, or sometimes they're called jib shots, because in movies they use a jib arm to get these shots. And they're used in movies all the time. And it used to be a pretty expensive shot, actually. I mean, movie producers would get stress-related illnesses every time their director wanted a crane shot because of all the extra equipment, crew, and time needed to shoot one. But now, with just a smartphone and a gimbal, we can shoot a crane shot in a couple of minutes. And if you want to shoot a real crane shot where the camera moves to or from a high position, all you need is to add a monopod like this. So if you've seen some of my other videos on this gimbal, you'll probably know about using the monopod. So you just screw it into the base of the gimbal and now you have extra reach. But just to be clear about how to get a crane shot with a OM4 or 3 gimbal, it cannot tip forward like other gimbals. It reaches a limit where it cannot tilt anymore. What we're trying to achieve is for the smartphone to remain at the same angle as it moves up or down. So we have to use a sideways movement. When we go from low to high sideways, you can see the gimbal is able to keep the smartphone at the same angle. And if possible, try to keep the smartphone going in a straight line rather than a curve. So you have to kind of compensate as you move. Remember, creativity is playing. So don't get too hung up on getting it right. Just try things and see what happens. Why not experiment? why not invent your own shots? The next gimbal mode I want to talk about is FPV, which stands for First Person View. When we select this mode, the gimbal will now be free to follow our movements on all 3 axes. In FPV mode, if I make a pan movement, the gimbal will follow. If I make a tilt movement, the gimbal will follow. And now the gimbal will also follow if I make a roll movement. So this is that movement where the horizon tilts, which isn't normally how we view the world. But the advantage of doing something unusual is that it gets the viewer's attention. Unlocking the roll axis on the gimbal unlocks more creative potential in your OM4 or 3 gimbal. Now we can have our smartphone camera move in a more fluid way, and we can start to be a bit more imaginative with our shots, especially if we're shooting some B-roll and we're planning to edit these shots to some music. Before I shoot anything, I'll usually think about the energy that I want to create. And if you want to move from a kind of beginner level to a more professional level, I really recommend that you work this way too. And one way to do this is to find the music that you'll use before you start shooting. So I could even download this music onto my phone, so I can remind myself of the energy in the music when I'm about to get the shot. And better still, have the music playing over your headphones while you're getting the shot. And when you come later to edit these shots to the music, they will much more likely to fit the energy you want to create with your B-roll sequence. So it might be helpful to remember each of these 3 modes that we've just talked about unlocks one or more of the axes on your gimbal. FPV mode unlocks all 3 motors. Follow mode unlocks 2 motors, the pan and tilt axes. And finally, tilt locked mode unlocks 1 motor, the pan axis. The DJI OM4 and 3 allow 3 other gimbal modes. We're probably not going to use them as much as the first 3, but they're still useful modes to have. The first of these modes that I want to talk about is called SpinShot. So I'm going to navigate to gimbal modes in the DJI app and select the final mode in the list, SpinShot. When we are in SpinShot mode, the gimbal follows our movements on all 3 axes, just like in FPV mode. The only difference between SpinShot and FPV mode is that we can now use the joystick to make the smartphone spin. Again, we can have fun shooting creative B-roll shots with this mode, but using the joystick to spin the smartphone instead of rolling our wrists means the shot is a little bit easier to get and it will look more even as it moves. The SpinShot allows your smartphone to turn quite a long way, but it's not actually the full 360 degrees. And also you can spin your smartphone both clockwise and anti-clockwise. If you want to change the speed of the spin, go into settings where we change modes and look for a setting called control stick speed. There's 3 speeds to choose from, and this will change the speed of the spin and actually anything else you do with the joystick, like panning and tilting. Again, when we use this shot, we're showing the world in a way we don't normally experience it. So when would we want to use this kind of shot? So most likely we won't be using this shot for talking to camera or scenes with actors talking, unless the characters are drunk or on drugs or something like that. I think the best use of this mode is again for B-roll shots. Having the camera spin, if used well, can add extra dynamic to the shot. We can also use a spin shot to create a cool transition if we match the spin in 2 or more shots. So okay, what about locked mode? When an Osmo Mobile gimbal is in locked mode, all the axes are locked. So whichever way you move your hand, the gimbal will try to keep the smartphone in the same position. And there's a couple of reasons why you might want to use locked mode. The first one is if you want the camera to remain facing the same direction while you need some kind of mobility to get the shot. So for example, you might be walking in one direction and then you need to change direction during the shot. But for creative reasons, you want the smartphone to stay pointing at the same subject. What if you want to get a tracking shot moving forward, but there's an obstacle in the way? Well, you could walk around it, but it might look cool if the shot passes over the obstacle. So by using locked mode, you can move around the obstacle while holding the gimbal over it. The question is, how do we get into locked mode? Because, as you may have noticed, it's not on our list or in the settings, but actually it's very easy. all you have to do is press down and hold the trigger button on the gimbal. While you're holding the trigger down, all axes will be locked. And as soon as you release, you return back to your previous mode. And this makes it really easy to switch to this mode on the fly. So you can be quite spontaneous if you spot an opportunity to use this mode during a shot. So the final gimbal mode is actually called Sport Mode. In Sport Mode, the gimbal is much more reactive to your movements. But at the same time, it's not as smooth. So earlier I talked about how the gimbal slows to a stop at the end of a shot. But in Sport Mode, the gimbal will suddenly stop when you stop. DJI call this Sport Mode because they're suggesting you use this to capture any fast-paced action. You can switch to Sport Mode just by going into settings in the Mimo app and toggling it on. But another easier way is to double tap the trigger and hold on the last tap. The gimbal enters Sport Mode and then switches back when you release the trigger, just like with locked mode. I don't think I would really use this mode very much because personally I use the gimbal to kind of smooth out the movements. But Sport Mode will actually pick up all those little hand movements and make your video look a bit more jerky. So if I want those kind of shots, I think I would just hold the smartphone in my hand and use the phone's inbuilt stabilization to smooth it out a bit. So there are other modes that I want to tell you about, but these modes are more to do with the position of the gimbal rather than how the motors operate. Upright position mode is how we normally use the gimbal, held upright in our hand or resting on a surface using the tripod legs. An interesting position mode we can use is called Underslung Mode. So all we do is turn the gimbal upside down. The DJI OM4 or 3 will keep your smartphone in the same position, and now we can try to capture some low angle shots. So how about following your feet as you're walking? This can be a really nice shot. Again, this is not an angle from which we normally experience the world, so you can give your audience a new perspective. If we move along with the smartphone camera low, the sense of movement is exaggerated, and the ground seems to kind of fly past. Another positional mode is the side grip mode. To use the side grip mode, just hold the gimbal handle at about 90 degrees. Holding the gimbal in this position gives us more options for interesting angles. So with the gimbal at 90 degrees, we can have our smartphones fly over surfaces, and you can get some really cool shots this way. And if you add a monopod to extend the handle, you can get shots from angles where you wouldn't normally be able to reach, like this shot flying over wildflowers, for example. The final positional mode is called Low Position Mode. So to switch to low position mode, press and hold the trigger. Now angle the gimbal at 90 degrees away from you. So this is useful if you want to shoot a push-in shot, and you want to be able to hold the gimbal more like when you're holding a flashlight, and some people even call this flashlight mode. And you can also get low angle shots easier this way. And remember, when you want to reposition your smartphone back to the default position, just double tap this trigger button. Now let's look at the Mimo app and the different modes that we can use to create different types of shots. So the DJI Mimo app has tracking capabilities, which allows you to lock the camera onto an object and try to keep the object in frame. But not just in the frame, the gimbal will also try to keep the object in the same position in the frame. And that's quite an important difference. So let's take a look at how the active track works on the Mimo app. Right now I'm in video mode in the Mimo app. And if I draw my finger over an object, which can be a person or anything you want, the app now locks onto the object. Now when I move the gimbal, it tries to keep the object in the middle of the frame. We can also adjust the position using the joystick. So if I move the joystick up and down, it also moves the position of the object in the frame. So this is really useful if you're filming yourself or someone else talking to the camera. Because if we're framing someone, we don't really want their face right in the middle. It's not really a nice looking shot. Really, we want them nearer the top of the frame. If you use the rule of thirds grid, you can sort of use that top line and place your eyes on that line. And that's quite a good way to frame yourself or a subject. And by the way, you can also start tracking just by tapping the trigger once. And also, to stop tracking, you just tap the trigger once again. Now, one side of using active track is that we can't lock exposure at the same time. So that's something to bear in mind when you're using it. Before I talk about the modes available in the app, let me give you a little tip about getting exposure right if you're using an iPhone. This is especially relevant for the newer iPhones. So if you have an iPhone 11 or 12, this will make a bit of a difference to you. If you're filming inside and the windows are overexposed, they can look a bit ugly when you pan if the exposure isn't locked. You can see the windows changing exposure as you move the camera. And sometimes you even get really bad flickering. And this is basically unusable if you're trying to do something a bit more professionally. But if you move and face the window and tap on the window area, you should see this yellow exposure box move there. And now the window should be properly exposed. So hold on this yellow box to lock exposure. So now as we move the gimbal, see how the exposure is much more even. The iPhone is able to do this using a process known as dynamic tone mapping. Once locked, the iPhone actually remembers to expose the windows correctly, even if you pan away and back again. So if you're filming inside, try this method to make sure the windows look good. There might still be some flickering going on from the tone mapping, but it's usually much better if you do this first. Now let's look at how to get great hyperlapse and time-lapse shots as well as motion-lapse shots with your DJI OM4 gimbal. Hyperlapse and time-lapse shots both compress time, so your final video will be speeded up dramatically compared to normal speed. So there is a difference between these two modes. Time-lapse is a shot where your smartphone and gimbal are stationary, whereas hyperlapse is a shot where you move with the gimbal. So let me give you some tips for shooting the best hyperlapse videos using your OM4 gimbal. At first, I recommend using the highest resolution here. Choose the amount you want time to be compressed for the final shot. We can choose from 5 times faster than normal up to 30 times faster than normal. So we want to balance the effect with creating something which works visually. So 30 times might be a bit too fast, and then the shot is over before we get a chance to enjoy it. So for this shot, I'm going to choose 15 times. And it's probably a good idea to lock white balance as well. Go into white balance and choose the preset which most suits your shot. The important thing is that the white balance doesn't change during the shot and that the colors look relatively natural and realistic. So hyperlapse shots can look really great if we use a prominent object as a focal point, maybe a building or a statue. And once you start recording, move towards the object at a steady pace. Circling the object also looks really nice. So if we turn on the grid lines, this will help us keep the camera pointing at the same position in the frame as we move. So in this shot, I'm using the building as my focal point, and I try to keep it in the middle of these grid lines. Another little trick with the OM4 is to use the object tracking feature. We can lock onto the object, and this will keep the focal point in the center of the frame for the whole shot. Time-lapse shoots images at a very slow frame rate and then plays those frames back much faster. So time appears to be moving extremely fast. Once selected, time-lapse controls appear at the top of the screen. First setting is how often you want the camera to shoot a frame, measured in seconds. You can choose from every half a second up to once per minute. The higher this setting, the faster your time-lapse will go. And next, you can set how long you want the camera to keep shooting. If you leave it set to infinity, it will keep shooting until you stop it manually. And the final setting is path. So if you want the gimbal to move the camera during the time-lapse, then use this setting to program in a path. You can add up to 4 points that you want the camera to move between. But personally, I don't think I would use more than 2 points, because with 2 points, the time-lapse will move smoothly in one direction, whereas with 3 or 4 points, it's going to suddenly change direction during the shot, and I don't really think that looks very good to me. So if you set a path, notice that you can't also have duration at infinity, because the Mimo app needs to know the duration because it uses this to measure the time between each point. So it's a good idea to lock exposure and white balance before recording. So once everything is set, press record and Mimo will begin capturing your time lapse. So using the Mimo app, you can shoot what's known as a vertigo shot. It's called a vertigo shot because the shot was made famous after being used in the film Vertigo, directed by the legendary master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock. Another well-known use of the shot was by Steven Spielberg in the movie Jaws. It can also be known as the trombone shot or the dolly zoom, and the last name tells you how the shot is achieved. You dolly towards or away from your subject, whilst at the same time zooming in or out. And the idea is to keep the subject in the same position and at the same size while you move. If you get it right, the subject stays the same while the background either expands outwards or shrinks inwards. And this is obviously not how we normally experience the world, which is why the shot is often used in movies to indicate a character is suffering some kind of emotional stress. So in the film Vertigo, the main character suffers from a crippling fear of heights. And the dolly zoom is used to indicate a moment where he's running up a high tower. In the film Jaws, the main character is observing a shark attack, and the dolly zoom is used to indicate his feeling as he realizes what's happening. And there's two ways to create this shot. Move towards the subject while zooming out, or move away from the subject while zooming in. You can actually create this shot using your phone, start recording, and zoom in or out as you move towards or away from your subject. But using the Mimo app, it is a bit easier because it handles the zooming part for you. So in the Mimo app, they call this shot the Dynazoom. When you switch to Dynazoom mode, the app asks you to decide which kind of dolly zoom shot you want to create. So basically the choice is between background shrinking or background expanding. And to select, you have to tap the screen and then tap Done in the top right corner. If you change your mind and you want to choose the other option, you can select it from a small drop-down menu at the top. Now, if you choose to move in during the shot, make sure to start a good distance away from the subject. Alternatively, if you choose to move out during the shot, start close to your subject. And next, you need to draw your finger across the subject to start active track. Once the app has locked onto the subject, press record, and the app will now tell you to move in or out, depending which version of the shot you chose at the beginning. Tap record and move slowly forwards or backwards. Now this shot is going to look better if you have an interesting background. If the subject is against a plain wall, you're not going to see much of an effect. Try to use a location that has plenty of features around. I recommend that you have your subject at the same level as the camera. Otherwise, when you move forwards or backwards, the angle of the camera is also going to change. Now also try to move in a straight line away or towards your subject, because again, if you're at an angle, the effect doesn't really come out so well. The Mimo app has a slow motion mode, but if you want to shoot slow motion, my advice is to use the native app in your smartphone, because I think you will get the best quality results this way. So my preferred method of shooting slow motion using the DJI OM4 and, for example, my iPhone 12 Pro Max is to set it at 60 frames per second and then slow the clip down to 40% on a 24 frames per second timeline. And I will either use the Mimo app or the iPhone app. It doesn't make too much difference in this case. If I select the slow motion mode in the Mimo app, I only get one choice, which is 1080p and 8 times slower. So this is actually quite an interesting question. If we're using a gimbal like the OM4, do we need to use the app that comes with it? So let's talk about the pros and cons of using the Mimo app against using the native app that comes with our smartphone. Now, should we use the Mimo app or our phone's native app? The advantages of the Mimo app are the extended features such as active track, programmable time-lapse, story mode, and so on. But you might find when it comes to basic video or photo quality, your native app is actually better. And this is especially true with Android devices, because in my experience, the Mimo app does not work as well on Android devices as it does on iPhones. In fact, all the gimbal apps I've tried, and that's Hoem, Jiun, and Moza, they all work better on iOS. And I know that a lot of gimbal users simply never use the app that comes with the gimbal. So how do we use our gimbal with our phone's native camera app? What we can do is set the mode we want to use in the Mimo app, like follow, tilt locked, and so on. And now switch to the native camera app and the gimbal will remember the mode. And if the gimbal is already in the mode you want, you don't even need to open the Mimo app. So this is my iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I power up the gimbal, and you can see, if we go into Bluetooth, that the phone is connected to the gimbal without using the Mimo app. And when I open the native camera app, the shutter button works to start recording in the native app. And in photo mode, it even takes a picture. And double tapping the M button will still change the orientation without the Mimo app running. Double tapping the trigger will also recenter the gimbal. And the joystick will pan and tilt. So you can see you still have most of the basic controls of the gimbal without even opening the Mimo app. One thing you can't use is the zoom rocker, and you also can't change gimbal modes. So if you're just filming simple shots and you want the best quality, you're probably better off using the native app. But if you want those extra features and those extra controls, then you're going to have to boot up the Mimo app. Did you know that you can use your Osmo gimbal as a kind of smartphone power bank? At the top of the screen in the left corner, the Mimo app lets you know the battery levels in your smartphone and the gimbal. I generally find that my smartphone battery drains faster than the gimbal. The M4 should last about 15 hours of constant use, but shooting video and being connected to Bluetooth really uses a lot of energy in the phone. So one tip is, if you find your phone is running low, but the gimbal is still well charged, you can use the gimbal as a power bank. So just under the bottom motor is a port where you can connect a power cable from the gimbal to your smartphone. This is actually a USB-A socket. So in this case, I need a USB-A to Lightning cable to connect my iPhone 12 Pro Max. So everything I've talked about so far has been about using the gimbal with just a smartphone on its own. But there are times when we like to add extras to our smartphone, like lenses or filters. The problem is this adds extra weight to one side of the gimbal, and then you might find that the gimbal struggles to keep the smartphone level. So let's look at how to deal with this extra weight. So if you're filming in daylight, but you want a slow shutter speed or more cinematic motion blur, you will need to use an ND filter. And this is one from Sandmark, which clips over the lens, but it does add extra weight to this side of the smartphone. And if we want to add an anamorphic lens, like this one by Moment, this is even heavier than the filter. And if I want to add a filter onto the anamorphic, now I'm putting more and more weight onto this side of the gimbal. Thing is, your phone is already heavier on this side because of the camera, and eventually it becomes pretty much impossible to balance the phone on the gimbal. So one solution is to add counterweights. So if you look here at the top of the OM4, you can see there is a hole, and this is where you can add the counterweights. And it's the same with the OM3. So these weights are by Ulanzi, which come in threes. Just add however many you need, depending on how much the extras weigh. So this isn't really a complete solution because sometimes the extras are a bit too big for the gimbal or just too heavy for the motors to handle. At some point, if you really want to use lots of extras on your smartphone, you might want to think about using a bigger gimbal. And also bear in mind, overloading the motors might wear them out quicker and also use up the gimbal's battery faster. So that's it for this video. If you found it useful, just let me know by tapping that like button. And if you want to go deeper into the subject of smartphone filmmaking, you can join us on Patreon, where I've got all kinds of extras and behind the scenes material. There's also 5 episodes of Amazon Prime series that I shot using smartphones. And we had, I think, 10 new patrons last month. So thank you to those guys, and anyone else wants to join us, we see you there.